Hey, good Friday morning. Good Friday morning. I am just going to jump into this devotion today. And this devotion is it's about the Holocaust. And Wednesday, every January 27th, and this past Wednesday was January 27th. It was International Holocaust Remembrance Day. International Holocaust Remembrance Day. And I've had the opportunity to visit Yad Vashem. It's the Holocaust Museum in Jerusalem. Several folks watching this today, you've been there. But in 2018, we were taken to Holocaust Museum by a national hero of Israel, Shraga ben Yosef. He took over our tour when his son had to go for a family emergency. And Shraga was one of the heroes of the 6-Day War in Israel. And at the end of that battle, the mayor of Jerusalem and the mayor of Bethlehem turned over papers of surrender to Shraga ben Yosef. And in 2018, as a gift to my family and to our group, he took us to the Holocaust Museum. And as we stood outside of the museum, he began to tell his story of his family's suffering, of relatives that are no longer with us. And as he began to share the stories, tears were running down his cheeks. And in our group, tears were running down the cheeks of almost everyone there. And before we went to the museum, I think almost everyone gave Shraga a hug. And there was nothing we could say. We just hugged him to let him know that we care. And this is a book that we bought for my daughter, Amanda. And this has every article, every picture, every story, every archived, everything that is there in that museum. It's in this book. And it's called Yad Vashem. It's from Isaiah chapter 56, verse 5. Isaiah 56, verse 5. And to them I will give in my house and within my walls a memorial and a name. And that's Yad Vashem, an everlasting name that shall not be cut off. And so when you hear the name Yad Vashem, it's the Holocaust Museum in Jerusalem. And it says this is for the 6 million members of the Jewish people who were doomed to tormented martyrdom, slaughter, and perdition by the Nazis and those who assisted. And I want to share with you a story of a miracle that happened, a miracle that impacted a couple who lived through the horrors of the Nazis. And this is a true story that I'm going to share with you. On the morning of January 10th, 1948, a gentleman by the name of Sternberger boarded the 909 as usual. He was en route and suddenly decided to visit Laszlo Victor, a Hungarian friend who lived in Brooklyn, New York. And this friend happened to be sick. Accordingly, at Ozone Park, Sternberger changed to the subway for Brooklyn. I can't even talk. He went to his friend's house. He stayed until mid-afternoon. He then boarded a Manhattan-bound subway for his Fifth Avenue office. And here is his story. The car was crowded, and there seemed to be no chance of a seat. But just as I entered, a man sitting by the door suddenly jumped up to leave. and I slipped into the empty place. I've been living in New York long enough not to start conversations with strangers. But being a photographer, I have the peculiar habit of analyzing people's faces, and I was struck by the features of the passenger on my left. He was probably in his late 30s, and when he glanced up, his eyes seemed to have a hurt expression in them. He was reading a Hungarian language newspaper, and something prompted me to say in Hungarian, "I hope you don't mind if I glance at your paper." The man seemed surprised to be addressed in his native language, but he answered politely, "You may read it now. I'll have time later on." During the half-hour ride, we had quite a conversation. He said his name was Bela Paskin, a law student when World War II started. He had been put into a German labor battalion. He was sent to the Ukraine. Later, he was captured by the Russians and put to work burying the German dead. After the war, he covered hundreds of miles on foot until he reached his home in Debrecen, a large city in eastern Hungary. I myself knew Debrecen quite well, and we talked about it for a while. Then he told me the rest of his story. When he went to the apartment once occupied by his father and his mother, his brothers, his sisters, he found strangers living there. Then he went upstairs to the apartment that he and his wife once had. It was also occupied by strangers. None of them had ever heard of his family. As he was leaving, full of sadness and tears, a boy ran after him, calling, "Paskin, Baxi, Paskin, Baxi." That means Uncle Paskin. The child was the son of some old neighbors of his. He went to the boy's home and he talked to his parents. "Your whole family is dead," they told him. "The Nazis took them, and they took your wife to Auschwitz." Auschwitz was one of the worst Nazi concentration camps. Paskin gave up all hope. A few days later, too heartsick to remain any longer in Hungary, he set out again on foot, stealing across border after border until he reached Paris. He managed to migrate to the United States in October of 1947, just 3 months before I met him on that train. All the time he had been talking, I kept thinking that somehow his story seemed so familiar. A young woman whom I just recently met at the home of friends had also been from that little town called Debrecen in Hungary. She had been sent to Auschwitz. From there, she was transferred to work in a German munitions factory. Her relatives had all been killed in the gas chambers. Later, she was liberated by the American Army, and she was brought here in the first boatload of displaced persons in 1946. Her story had moved me so much that I had written down her address and her phone number because I was intending to invite her to meet my family and thus help relieve the terrible emptiness that was in her life. It seemed impossible that there could be any connection between these two people, but as I neared my station, I fumbled anxiously in my address book. I asked, in what I hoped was a casual voice, "Was your wife's name Maria?" He turned pale. "Yes," he answered. "How did you know?" He looked as if he were about to faint. I said, "Let's get off the train." I took him by the arm at the next station and led him to a phone booth. He stood there like a man in a trance while I dialed her phone number. It seemed hours before Maria Paskin answered. Later, I learned her room was alongside the telephone, but she was in the habit of never answering it because she had so few friends, and the calls were always for someone else. This time, however, there was no one else at home, and after letting the phone ring for a while, she responded. When I heard her voice at last, I told her who I was, and I asked her to describe her husband to me. She seemed surprised at the question, but gave me a description. Then I asked her where she had lived in Debrecen, and she told me the address. Asking her to hold the line, I turned to Paskin, and I said, "Hey, did you and your wife live on such and such a street?" Yes, Bila Paskin exclaimed. He was white as a sheet, and he was trembling. "Try to calm," I urged him. "Calm down. Something miraculous is about to happen to you. Here, take this telephone and talk to your wife." He nodded his head in mute bewilderment, his eyes bright with tears. He took the receiver, listened a moment to his wife's voice, then suddenly he began to weep. "This is Bella, this is Bella." And he began to mumble hysterically. Seeing that the poor fellow was so excited he couldn't talk coherently, I took the receiver from his shaking hands. "Stay where you are," I told Maria, who also sounded hysterical. "I'm sending your husband home to you. We will be there in a few minutes." Bella was crying like a baby and saying over and over again, "It's my wife. I want to go to my wife." At first I thought I'd better accompany Paskin, lest the man should faint from excitement. But I decided that this was a moment in which no strangers should intrude. Putting Paskin into a taxi cab, I directed the driver to take him to Maria's address. I paid the fare, and I said goodbye. Bela Paskin's reunion with his wife was a moment so amazing, so electric, with suddenly released emotions, that afterward neither he nor Maria could recall too much about it. I remember that when I left the phone, I walked to the mirror like in a dream to see if maybe my hair had turned gray. She said later, "That's what I did." The next thing I know, a taxi stops in front of the house, and it's my husband who comes towards me. Details I cannot remember. Only this I know, that I was happy for the first time in many, many years. I felt happiness. Even now, it's difficult to believe that it happened. We have both suffered so much. I've almost lost the capability to not be afraid. Every time my husband goes from the house, I say to myself, will anything happen to take him from me again? Her husband is confident that no horrible misfortune will ever again befall the two of them. Providence has brought us together, he says simply. It was meant to be. That's a true story. That's a true story about two people who've lost their family during the Holocaust, but through a miraculous set of circumstances, husband and wife were joined together once again, but this time in the safety of America. I share that with you today because when you think of the Holocaust, I never ever want any person, any group to suffer and to experience anything like the Jewish people experienced. I have friends from all over the world. I have Muslim friends, Jewish friends, Christian friends. I have non-religious friends. I have friends who are into Wicca. I have friends who just come from different backgrounds. And I pray that all of us can take care of one another. And if you're a person of faith, let's pray for one another. And let's pray that something like the Holocaust will never happen again in our lifetime or ever. Hey, this is Pastor Bill from St. Luke's United Methodist Church, Harrisville, West Virginia, Ritchie County, West Virginia. Wherever you are, I hope you're happy, I hope you're healthy, and I hope you're safe. Have a great Friday and have a wonderful weekend. God bless each and every one of you.